Best laid plans in a trash compactor. Nuisance factor, nuisance factor. Can't get herpes from a tractor. Nuisance factor, nuisance factor. In the way of what you're after. Nuisance factor, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Well, hello, Adam Rowe.
Well, hello, Boris guys. These pretzels are making me thirsty.
Well, who do we have with us today, sir?
We have our friend and non-toga wearing fan of the Roman Empire, David Grigolczyk.
Hello, David.
I've worn a toga before, just so you know.
I have too, but presently non-toga wearing.
Oh, wow.
Have you ever worn toga?
No, but I feel like I need to now. I feel majorly left out.
In our pre-nuisance factor discussions of the topic today, I postulated that what the real cause of the fall of the Roman Empire was the togas.
That is a factor.
Well,
we can talk about that.
Okay, I'd like to hear it.
So David happens to be a fan of Rome and a fan of history. And so he suggested that we talk about the decline and the fall of the Roman Empire today, which, of course, immediately made me think about the current meme situation. So I thought I'd start us off with a little clip from a recent SNL episode that happened to be pretty funny. So let's do that.
What you thinking about, baby?
Me? I'm just thinking about sucking all the wolves' titty.
All right, that was awesome.
Yes, indeed.
So, are you guys familiar, kind of, with the current meme situation?
I am a bit familiar with it. I was introduced to it by a friend a few months ago who approached me sort of out of the blue and asked me, "Do you think about the Roman Empire?" And I was taken aback a bit, and I was like, "Sometimes." And she just gave me a knowing nod and look, and I was like, okay. But I found out later on through conversations with other people who are more tuned into pop culture than myself after that apparently it is some sort of litmus test or meme that women are using to evaluate men by, or at least that's the information that I received when I presented this issue to several female persons I know.
Yeah, and I guess it's being used to disparage men, but it's kind of interesting. I guess the originator was a guy, like a Swedish guy on TikTok who goes by the moniker Gaius Flavius, who does Roman history videos on TikTok, and I guess it all kind of started with him. But what was interesting is that kind of if you go and just Google men and Rome, you get a bunch of articles, including one from this Callie Holterman lady with the New York Times, where she talks about, where she kind of ties the obsession of men with Rome to the current gendered academic climate, for lack of better terminology there.
Thinking about Rome as racist?
It not only racist, it's also very sexist. And, obviously white cisgender men are the ones who are obsessed with it, presumably because they want to relive the glory of the ancient West. And of course, they're overlooking the fact that the Roman Empire was kind of diverse, and so
especially the second part of it, right? I mean, it was extremely diverse.
So anyway, kind of fun things going on in our culture today.
But by the way, that predates the stuff, predates a while. I'm a member of a number of different groups, and the stuff on Facebook as far as Rome culture and memes and things like that, I mean, it's a fun kind of nerdy exercise. Like, think of the first Latin word that pops into your head, and so this is a way just to kind of like take up your day. I mean, there's so many different facets of Rome that you could focus in on. So it's somewhat of a hobby for people. And I think men are driven by themselves to be hobby-centric. So, some of us like fishing. Some of us like this. Some of us like, poker.
Some of us are huge nerds.
Yeah.
And like Rome.
Yeah. First Latin word that pops in your head, go.
E pluribus.
I think that's 2 words.
Pluribus.
You lose. My word is bono.
Bono.
Ooh.
Triumvirate.
Very close to boner, huh?
Triumvirate.
Yes, exactly.
Triumvirate. Is that a Latin word?
Yeah, I mean, that's...
Okay. All right, cool. So but the interesting thing about Rome is obviously the potential parallels to what we're dealing with today in America. You've said before that you feel like we're in decline, and that maybe the decline of Rome kind of parallels something, or maybe holds some lessons for us to take away. So we want to, and you've also been reading Edward Gibbon's major kind of seminal work on the history of the Roman Empire that was published back in 1776, 75, and so. I want to start kind of with the question of the collapse itself. There's some controversy as to when it occurred or whether it even occurred. Is that correct?
Yeah, so, our common thought when we hear of a word collapse, we think of a bridge falling, a building falling over. If we hear of a country collapsing, an economic collapse, we always think of a thunderous moment like, the black market in 1929, or, perestroika in Russia where there's food lines. And so we always conceive of collapse as a thing that happens like that. I think the application of the word collapse to the western part of the Roman Empire is not descriptive of what actually happened. I think that just like with a road, just like with a bridge, just like with any human-made institution, there is a period of decay before something collapses. And so it takes time for it to, become decrepit and for it to fall over. And I think the roots of the Roman collapse probably had been going on for hundreds of years prior to that point. And then at the point in time when the last Western Roman emperor was dethroned, I don't think anyone on the ground noticed a collapse. I think it would have been business as usual because of the fact that it slowly decayed to such a level where people just kept on living their lives. Now, not in all parts of the Western Roman Empire, mainly Italy, but if you looked in England when they were being invaded by Anglo-Saxons, I mean their population collapsed from like 2 million to less than a couple 100,000. So clearly they suffered a lot more. But the main part of the Western Roman Empire, what we think of Italy, they continued to get water into the city. The aqueducts continued to work even after the last emperor was deposed for about 150 years. They still continued to have a Senate all the way up to 700 AD, 800 AD. So, the thought of a Roman collapse being this one event, that's not how it went down.
What about the idea that, well, really it was just the sort of socioeconomic military empire that collapsed, because the spiritual empire of the Catholic Church actually survived and even became stronger after the collapse. Is that not correct?
Yeah, so we can look at the religious aspect of it. That's one facet of it. That's what Gibbon's work focuses on. But military might, that is central to a state maintaining its boundaries, especially in a time period like back then as opposed to now. Borders were fluid. They changed. And so the military, by my estimation, as far as when it started to become weaker, is when it started bringing in foreigners to be its military. When it stopped having Romans in the Roman military because discipline went out the window. But the main event, how they recruited soldiers to join the Roman military was by taking the places that they had conquered, say England, France, Gaul, places like that, and offering them citizenship by virtue of them joining the military and doing 20 years of service. In, I think, about 2017 AD, the Emperor Caracalla, who was a notorious despot, dictator, decided to give out citizenship to all of the free citizens wherever they were located in Gaul, England. And this basically eliminated any incentive for anyone that was living in these places to join the military, to work themselves up, to do their 20 years of service. And that left only one choice. That's to invite the Goths in to join your military, because where else are you going to get the manpower?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I also read that the aristocracy ultimately was not as involved in the military, and so but to Adam's point, though, it seems like you kind of glossed over it, right? So,
we're going to go back to that, but that's a big thing.
What's interesting is that I've always heard that Christianity might have precipitated the end of the Roman Empire, and I think Adam is suggesting that maybe Christianity is a symbol of the survival or the persistence of the Roman Empire, even beyond the point where there might have been a political collapse. Do you not see it that, or
close? But I mean, I think basically what you said is how I see it. But I mean, to me, there's power and a certain quantity of power accumulated in the executive, legislative portion of the Roman Empire, represented by the emperor and the legions and etc. And then a certain quantity of power accumulated in the spiritual sort of hierarchy of the Roman Empire, which is the Catholic Church. And for whatever reason, this power nexus evaporated or dispersed to other things, but somehow the Catholic Church was able to hold that power nexus together they still exist. And at one point, maybe 300 years or so after the collapse, they held military power as well. The Pope was a very powerful military prince from about 900 AD to about 1400 AD. So, I mean, it's very interesting.
So I think it would be more of a value thing. At the end of the day, once everybody became Christian and they looked and they frowned upon with indignation what they were and what their society had done for centuries, slavery, et cetera, and they looked at it and said, being Roman, as far as our old Roman, is shameful. And those old values are shameful. It doesn't matter if you're a barbarian as long as you convert to Christianity and Catholicism. The Catholic Church is going to continue to reign because ultimately we're just preparing for the afterlife. Our world here is a horrible world that we live in, and the reason why Christianity, didn't take over for hundreds of years until about maybe 300 AD is because when things are great, nobody's going to be looking to a death cult, a religion that basically is preaching for everybody just to forget about this world and abandon all the joys and pleasures and just look for the afterlife. But once the Roman barbarian horde is invading, your cities are burning, you can't feed your family and everything else, and it looks like the apocalypse in Revelation. And what these people are saying, you guys, this is the end of times, you need to convert. That starts to ring true to a population, because if the current polytheistic religion isn't giving you it, that's where you're going to go. And so that's why, I think Catholicism and the power centers that built up around it survived it, because they were selling something that the Roman Empire couldn't give them.
Yeah, and I think, to Adam's point, right, it also suggests that the Roman Empire maybe never collapsed and that it still lives on in the form of the Roman Catholic Church.
Well, we have the Eastern Roman Empire, and the way that they looked upon themselves as the real Romans. They spoke Latin for another 200 years until they went to Greek. There was no Eastern Orthodox and Catholic Church until the schism happened. So for a while, they were a unified church. They were all Catholic. And so they looked at it as they had just lost their provinces. This is why Justinian reinvaded Italy, and they took it back for like 200 years. So from their perspective, the Roman Empire lived on in the East. The same, we just gave it a name now. Now
they did wipe out a lot of Christian heretics, and there were constant pogroms and persecutions, right?
Sure.
Okay.
Well, a lot of those wipeouts occurred prior to the conversion, the official adoption of Christianity. The big era of the martyrs in the Roman Empire is in the 3rd century, the 200 ADs, before it became the official state religion. That's when you had, the legions going through the town and burning people at the stake and shooting them full of arrows, and etc.
And was that under Constantine that happened?
That was before Constantine.
It was the guy right before him, Diocletian. That's when they had the last major persecutions of Christians. But by then it already had, because Rome had gone through like 50 years of civil war and complete deterioration and almost collapse. And when Diocletian came along, Christianity was way more pervasive to where you couldn't just get rid of it like that. So
was Diocletian Christian?
No, he was.
So he persecuted
polytheist.
Christians.
Yeah.
But then Constantine was the first Christian emperor. Yes.
So, there's debate. He was the first one that got baptized, maybe on his deathbed. There's debate when but Constantine was a extremely good propagandist. And so his use of Christianity was a propaganda move more so than an embrace, because he felt like he could get better traction with the masses and things like that.
And I've heard it said and argued that that part of the reason why the Roman Empire eventually went to Christianity as a state religion is because they had to find some way to unite this entire diverse empire. They were they were struggling to find something to bring them into civic unity around, and they figured they got this religion that's already sort of spreading like wildfire in certain places. It's sort of a universalist religion. It has this it's descended from the Jewish idea of a chosen people and a chosen race and a destiny chosen by God, and so it became very convenient to adopt that dogma, that ethos, as a pole star around which to try to form the revolutions of this gigantic empire that they're trying to manage on 3 continents.
Well, yeah, keep in mind also at that time, you had already invited and settled Goths into your country. And how do you police the Goths and have that union? The only way you can do it is if you try and convert them to a unified religion. But what gave Rome its initial success all the way up to that point was a polytheistic religion that was accepting of every other faith, which no other religion in the world did. Most people, like the Persians, killed off people that weren't willing to accept, their religion. So by giving, polytheism to everybody, that basically invited, cohesion for a long time, because you weren't persecuting people within your borders. The problem arises: what do you do with the Jewish population who's unwilling to live with polytheists? Unwilling to cooperate, unwilling to...
Well, you had that big revolt that was crushed, and afterwards Judea was no longer as much of a threat, right?
Yeah.
I forget the name of the revolt.
It was
Maccabean.
So, and that revolt...
There were 2 Maccabean revolts, I believe. There were
and
civil wars.
And those revolts were really bad, and the reason why they were put down, a lot of people don't know, is because the Jewish people ended up massacring hundreds of thousands of Greeks. And so what do you do with a population that's not willing?
Why would they do that if they were being tolerated? I can understand, like, if you're being oppressed and your shit's getting taken, then you would want to lash out violently. But if they weren't being oppressed, if the Roman polytheistic society was, open to tolerating people who weren't being violent, why did they choose violence?
It's an assimilation thing. I think ultimately they refused to assimilate. But after that event... I think Antonius Pius, maybe 20, 30 years later, they put out an edict of tolerating the Jewish population. They invited them, they let them build temples in Rome and things like that. And I think that is the point where Christianity, because Christianity was viewed as a sect of Judaism. It wasn't viewed as independent. They were looked at 2 of the same. Mm-hmm. And so at that point, once they were invited in, that's when it started to flourish everywhere and started to spread. And, you can take it back at that point.
So after Jewish temples were being established in Rome, that's when Christianity picked up steam? So essentially as a result of tolerance for Judaism?
Correct.
Okay. So before we move on to the next question of essentially what were the primary causes of the collapse of the Roman Empire, I just want to ask you both: do you guys see the United States as facing collapse now, and do you believe that we can learn something from the Roman Empire to either stave off that collapse, or at least be able to predict what's going to happen in the next few phases of American history?
Adam or me? Okay. Go ahead. I say yes and no, and there's a couple of differences, and there's a whole bunch of similarities. And if we were maybe the British Empire 100 years ago, I would say for sure we're going towards a collapse. So there's a few things that, or not a few things, but a handful of things that indicate, things weren't going well. You had the military, you had, a cultural, you had a religious change. By the way, the religious change, once they assumed Christianity, there was no more desire to fight, essentially. A lot of it was very, pacifistic. They weren't, interested in serving in the military or things like that. So you had a whole lot of that. And so, economic as well. So if you look at the numbers of slaves, the slave population, continued to fall year over year. And so by the time, Rome, was, I guess, last emperor was gone, the economic driver of the Roman Empire, which is a huge enslaved population, was no longer there. The last major public works were built in Rome right when Constantine took over. So between that 150 years, no more public works were being built. So you go that time period, and you have an economic shift where they can no longer sustain their institutions, and so you basically resources, all this stuff, and then the last thing is technology. They were living off of their innovations, Archimedes, things like that, for hundreds of years.
You're already talking about the reasons for the collapse, right? But it sounds like you're drawing parallels to what we're. So I guess the only question I wanted to know right now, the answer to is you do see some parallels then between what the U.S. is going through right now and what Rome went through. Adam, do you see it that way as well?
Well, the last thing what I hit on is technology. Please. That's the one thing that it's not too clear that we're at a point where our technology has reached an end point. For a while, I was mocking social media as like an advancement technology. Come on, seriously? Not really. But the AI, potential revolution of AI, if it is real, lends to basically upending the cart for humanity as far as a civilization collapse. And so that could be one of the things that basically changes the equation or the whole circumstance.
Okay. Adam?
So, are we headed for an imperial collapse? I don't see an imperial collapse necessarily coming. Certainly, I think that our republic is probably already collapsed, or is in the process of no longer being a republic. I think we're past the event horizon on that one. I don't really think we have a republic, an American republic. So that part of it, yes, has collapsed, and there are, I think, at least echoes and rhymes between what happened here and what happened in Rome. Especially around the time of Caesar in Rome and et cetera, and that transition. As far as is our empire facing collapse, for me, the jury's still out on that. I mean, I see things in our world today which I think could lead to a collapse. But when I look at the example of the Roman Empire and I see how the inertia of that edifice sort of carried itself along for 300, 400 years, I don't know that the American empire is necessarily headed towards an imminent collapse. I mean, all empires collapse eventually.
When do you think that we lost the republic?
Well, I think at the point where the CIA murdered the president and installed their own president, and then has continued to dominate the electorate as far as the controlling the members of the executive branch, and I think also the legislative branch as well. Since that time, I think that's it.
So Kennedy was the last American president?
Yes.
David, any comment on that?
I mean, I don't dispute any of that, but like when I started off saying this, that institutions, structures, everything takes a while to unwind. It maybe you can draw some kind of mathematical or scientific extrapolation from it. A concentration of energy takes a while naturally to decay. Uranium takes a while to decay. And so if you have institutions where you have organizations such as, the American institutions such as the FBI, the CIA, these things that ensure that the government runs, ensure that, resources are distributed, ensure that, we produce economic activity, provide us stability, like our, court system, for instance, it takes time for these institutions to become naturally corrupted. It takes time for them to naturally decay. So, slowly but surely, I think that's what's happening. There's a decay in all of these different things. And it won't be an imminent collapse, but I think, that train has left the tracks, as far as it's so hard to reverse because these bureaucracies are 10,000 people. 20,000 people. One, they are oblivious probably to it, but to move and fix a ton of people that are not willing to, we call it the deep state. Once they're entrenched, they're making tons of money off this. Why would they want to reform? Why would they want to get better? Same situation faced the Roman Empire. So.
I want to just real quick, I do see a correlation between what happened with the Praetorian Guard and the Roman Empire, beginning at the point where Gibbons begins his narrative, where the Praetorian Guard is essentially taking out emperors and installing new emperors at will for about 130 years or so. I think there's a very clear correlation between what was going on at that time and what's going on right now, beginning with Kennedy and this sort of small elite sort of black behind the scenes power center that has the ability to just simply take out the president and install a new one if they don't like what the president is doing. So I think that there's a rhyme there. There's a connection there. I'm not saying it's exactly the same thing, but there seem to be clear connections there to me.
The one thing I would say to that is it does seem like even after Kennedy, the government, whether it was a legitimate Republican government or some kind of deep state government, it seems to have been furthering the interests of the American people. Right, not always well, but certainly that seems to be the case. There was a Peter Thiel interview that he did with Rogan, where he points out that the kind of American souring on nuclear energy occurred after we supplied India with nuclear reactors for essentially to give them access to nuclear energy, and they ended up in a very short period of time weaponizing it and are now a nuclear power. So according to Peter Thiel, the position of the government changed regarding nuclear weapons at that time due to the blunder of essentially giving something that was thought to be relatively innocuous to India, and then them turning around and weaponizing it. So if that was orchestrated by the deep state, and it would have been within the time period that after Kennedy, obviously that happened, right?
Yes, it happened after Kennedy, but the idea that the people in the CIA and in the various upper echelons of power didn't know that you could take this nuclear technology and turn it into nuclear weapons in a very short period of time is a farce. That's ridiculous. They had to know that this was going to happen. They gave it to them because they wanted India to have the bomb, because they wanted to use India as a check probably to Chinese power or to Russian power. That would be my guess.
That's interesting.
I mean, that's a nice take on it. I mean, here's something else to kind of move the conversation on. So as far as this decay, my next question is this. We have probably the most intelligent group of people around nowadays, right? If you look back for history, probably the largest amount of intelligent people working in labs, creating innovations, all sorts of different industries. And so and probably in government too, in various institutions in the government. So my question is, perhaps maybe some of this decay, some of this decline is intentional. And I wonder that. And the reason why I wonder that is this. Perhaps there is a desire to diminish the U.S. in order to make it more easily, where we can unify other people into one entity, one global power, one global government. And if the U.S. is diminished enough, it makes it easier. If we're too high and we have too much stuff and we're too wealthy and we're too grandiose, how can we, basically assimilate people that are living in huts and teepees? And so the idea is by maybe diminishing us and increasing, the standard of living worldwide by giving our wealth away, by basically bringing these people in, we are creating or trying to create the future that these people see. And so that's my only other thought. Maybe it's done intentionally. Maybe the idea of diminishing us is being done intentionally. I don't know.
To the end of having a more controllable population
worldwide.
Right. Didn't you use that show Fallout as an example of what might be happening though before? So and that seems to be the opposite, right? They fragment society to have these like little laboratories of innovation.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, except that they meet in the corporate boardroom and they're all angry, and that's how the scene starts off, that the foreign power still hasn't nuked everybody. And so that, I'm thinking, maybe they're trying to get Russia to nuke everybody so they can implement this world vision. But if the Russians don't do it, hey, we got to maybe nuke ourselves to, implement this worldwide vision. But that's a separate thing. But, that's my thought. What do you guys think about that? Well, do you think that maybe the decay is intentionally, created?
My observation is that if you wanted, and if your desire was to form or to shape a political paradigm where the loyalty of the world is shifted from their local nationalities to some kind of world entity, before you could have any hope of achieving that goal, the first thing you would have to do is weaken the connection between the people and their current national entities. And what better way to do it than through, the process, through encouraging this process of decay, this inversion of values, this rejection of the ideals and the values and the norms that have stood in a civilization for, I guess we're 200 years old, 250 years old at this point.
Well, I feel really naive. I mean, I still think that our republic survives.
Well, I can't agree with that.
There's a competing vision. You can do that, or where most of us would think that's insane. Why would you want to destroy the institutions and the things that you built up? Well, the competing vision would be, why don't we lead from the front? Why don't we, like we have done in the past, try to sell people by example? And that's where, if it's by intent, I mean, I don't know why give up, trying to be the leader of the world and try to, influence by example.
We must destroy to create. We must create to destroy. Right? If we're going to create a world government, we have to destroy the civilization that came before it. That is the nature.
That is the silliest.
Well, maybe the Catholics were thinking the same thing.
I'm not saying that we should destroy it. I'm just saying that if your goal is to create a new paradigm, to create a new religion, to create a new world order, you have to destroy the old world order. And what better way to do that? I mean, nuking it or going to physical kinetic war with it is probably a poor solution. A much better solution would be to destroy it psychologically, to destroy the people's desire for it and offer them something new. And that may be what's going on. I don't know. David may be correct in some of that.
All right.
I mean, it's comparable actually to the Catholic religion in Rome. I mean, if you think about it, they offered something new, and they wanted to destroy what was built. They were shameful of it.
Did they use their propaganda and their power to actually undermine the pagan religions that were present in the empire? That was part of it, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, they banned the games in 100 years before it collapsed.
Right, but you guys aren't suggesting that the Christian incursion into Roman culture was like orchestrated by like an entity with some kind of goal in mind.
I think it was probably more or less organic, an offshoot of the Jewish religion, which I think if you read the Bible, for instance, and the text from that time, clearly it grew out of Judaism. That may or may not have been organic. I think most likely it was, but I think at some point the political animals in the Roman Empire, who were extremely savvy, realized that, hey, there's a seed of something here that we can use for this goal that we've had, which is to create a new foundation, a new pole star around which for all of these people's emotions and lives and hearts and minds to revolve. And I think that's how it happens. I think they saw the seed and they planted it and they watered it and it grew up.
Just like any hierarchical structure, once it becomes a hierarchical structure where you have people that have power, concentrations of power, I mean, naturally you're going to have, things like that happen.
Well, it just doesn't seem like, Christianity, you can see the attractiveness of it for people, right? Like you can understand why it became a global religion. Similarly, you can look at Islam and you can see why it might appeal to people.
I'm talking about, like the bishops, once they started managing huge amounts of wealth from people's donations. So once they started to influence, politics and religion, or the people's lives, you can see how that becomes a huge concentration of power, and you can wield a lot of power.
Isn't there a debate of whether religion came first or politics, like the use of religion for political gains came first? And it sounds like you're saying unequivocally that it was religion that came first, and then it was utilized by the politicians for their ends. But there's
I'm not saying that existentially in the question of politics and religion, but what it looks like as far as what happened in the Roman Empire, which is what we're discussing specifically, is there was a movement that sprung up perhaps as a grassroots movement, perhaps organically, perhaps not, but I think probably organically. And I think that the powerful people, the extremely powerful people, the most powerful people in the world who were running the Roman Empire were looking for something that they could use in the way that they ended up using it, and they grabbed a hold of it and they manipulated it to their own ends, which was to create a state religion, a Roman state religion.
So I guess what this gets back to is it a bad idea to view the plight of America as orchestrated by some central group or somebody that had kind of planned this collapse out? And is it not better to view it sort of as a parallel to what happened in Rome, i.e., certain ideas kind of take hold in culture, and then they may be utilized by the politicians, the Democrats with wokeness, the Republicans with evangelism, and they just take these trends and they use them for their political ends. But that would suggest a very different sort of idea behind the collapse. I.e., it is more organic rather than more orchestrated.
Yeah, but I mean, if you're selling people that this world is crap and all we have is that no matter how much we screw it up, just believe in your God and you'll be okay in the afterlife. Because that's essentially what happened. I mean, you didn't have a competent leadership. You didn't have focus on this life. You had essentially people selling people on an afterlife. And that's what it basically came down to. And all of the good things that the Roman Empire had done, centralized heating, running water, even today we're finding out fast food, things like that, scholarly learning, the Alexandria Library, all these different things, think about all of that was good of the Roman Empire, all the construction projects and things like that, to discard all of that, to just essentially, sell people on, this life sucks, let's go to the afterlife. I think that is done primarily just so these people can retain power and have no accountability. And that's also a parallel to this today.
But either they use the Christian idea, right? Or just kind of piggybacked off of it, or they created the Christian idea in order to use it as a vehicle for their ends. And
I don't think it matters at the end of the day.
A lot of people, I think, would disagree that Christianity is a bad idea. It sounds like you're saying, look, Christianity is a bad idea. If you want to have a cohesive, successful society, you want people grounded in this world. You want them focused on their immediate goals rather than...
No, I'm not saying Christianity is a bad idea. I'm saying for a entity like the Roman Empire that has a state religion that is part and parcel of its identity, that is its culture, that influences its military, that influences its economy, that influences all of its structure and its integrity and everything else. To discard it, you're essentially undermining all of these different things. And you can do that if, for instance, all of a sudden, say Saudi Arabia decides to become, Buddhist. What do you think is going to happen to its culture, its society, and everything else? It's going to crumble.
Right, but if they became, say, not Buddhist and they became, say, materialistic, whatever, it could enhance it. So it does seem like the quality of the idea has something to do with it, right? And you seem to be putting the collapse of the Roman Empire squarely at Christianity's feet.
No,
you seem to be saying
I think there are a number of elements, decay, but that's one of the main ones.
Okay, so that brings me to kind of the causes of the collapse, and we've kind of started touching on it, but I want you to elaborate a little bit more. Adam, do you have anything else to add to that last discussion about Christianity?
Well, I don't think Christianity was a cause of the collapse. I mean, it looks to me like the adoption of Christianity as the state religion and the enforcement of it by brutal propaganda and police power may be part of what generated the inertia which carried the Roman Empire along for another 300 years-ish, But I guess that's a debate that we'll never be able to answer.
Well, and to your earlier point, right? I mean, the idea that the Roman Empire still exists in the form of the Roman Catholic Church suggests that Christianity lended longevity to the idea of Rome.
Well, certainly, and the fact that the Catholic Church ended up becoming a military power that dominated Europe for 500 years or so, I think adds some weight to that observation.
Yeah, but those are situations as far as the Catholic Church was no longer of the Romans. You couldn't find a Roman by 400 AD. They had become so diverse. This is the other thing.
They were still based in Rome. They still can.
The
Catholic Church was based. in
Rome.
No.
I'm talking about the Roman emperors. They were no longer based in Rome for the last 150 years. They were in Milan. They were in other places.
I think it survived as a religious entity, not a political.
Transitioning to another point. By the time that it sort of collapsed by 476 AD, Rome was no longer ruled by Romans, and there were no Romans living in Rome. So culturally, they were ruled by emperors from Spain, by people from Syria, by Franks, Gauls, who were ethnically no longer already Roman. The people in the military were no longer Roman. If you walk down the street, you probably wouldn't find a Roman.
But originally, were Romans Roman?
As far as a genealogy.
Is there such a thing as Roman?
Well, yeah, that's
was
where
there ever?
They came from Rome. Julius Caesar was born in Rome. Octavian,
okay, so people
Pompey,
that were being born in Rome.
Yeah.
But the Roman Empire, you being born in the Roman Empire, that's not enough. So you're saying that essentially by spreading out all over these and having all these other cities, naturally, right, it leads to people being born in places other than the capital, and so then they're no longer as Roman as they might be otherwise.
I'm saying, as far as genealogy, the Latin genealogy. So you started having people that essentially were senators. Julius Caesar was the first one to diminish the Senate's authority. He decided to bring in a bunch of Gauls that he had just conquered into the Senate. And so you had Hadrian was born in Spain. These emperors like Hadrian and Antonius Pius, they were born over there, but they were still from Latin families. But by 300 AD, 400 AD, you were no longer seeing Romans ruling Rome. The senators were no longer Roman. The people in the military were no longer Roman. What I mean by that, they weren't. Their genealogy wasn't Latin.
Gotcha.
So you had basically a cultural shift as well,
so
not just
Latin,
religious shift.
Was Latin like an some kind of ethnic group?
Yeah, those
okay.
The Latins.
Okay. All right. Well, let's do this because you mentioned technology. I'd like to go kind of one by one, all of the common causes that historians give for the collapse, and I just want to get both of your takes, not just in the role that the given issue played in Rome and in the collapse of Rome, but also what form of that issue plays a role in the collapse of America today, if that's what's happening. So let's start with technology. David, you mentioned technology. Can you do that kind of back and forth contrast? The challenges that Rome faced with respect to technology as it relates to its collapse, and contrast that with what America is dealing with today.
Yeah, so I mean, with one of the most interesting things that I've heard of Pompeian excavations and stuff in the last maybe 10 years, Romans tended to when you don't bury someone, you burn them. What do they call that?
Cremation.
Cremate. They used to cremate everybody, but foreigners weren't cremated. And so in Pompeii, they had a guy who was, I think, from Greece that was buried. And what they were able to find out about this guy is the guy was initially enslaved. He became a freedman. He rose up and became independently wealthy by being a manager of a temple. He had other businesses. He had a bakery and things like that. And he became independently wealthy. And so there was opportunity through this guy's work, through his maybe innovation, from his efforts to progress from a slave person to an extremely wealthy person in Pompeii. And that is parallel to our society. We have people that are able to, no matter where they come from around the world, or maybe in the past this was more prevalent, but they could come here as immigrants. They could work, they could build up and have opportunities and succeed. Some of these people naturally have innovations, but by giving them an environment and an atmosphere where they could do that without fear of starvation, without fear of death, invasion, on all these other things, to be able to think freely, to not be under the pressure of being persecuted, that was what Rome offered. This is why you had millions and millions of people coming to Rome from all over the empire. You had scholarly learning. You had, some of the quotes from Cicero. When you compare them to this day, they're like perfect. Like you could see Cicero living in our society, and so that's some of the comparisons as far as us and Rome. The technology that they had. When that started to basically creep away, when we were living in when they were living in a hostile environment where they're worried about food, where they're worried about being killed and run off by barbarians, when they cannot be protected anymore, what are you going to be focused on? You're not going to be focused on innovation and sitting in a library and reading and thinking. And so roughly around 200 AD, you see a huge drop-off as far as scholarly pursuits and innovation and things like that. Dion Cassius, who Gibbon cites a lot, his books are essentially written in retrospect, and he's writing as if everything's collapsed, and he's like, all these great things, all this stuff has gone away, and and that's how he's writing his books in 230 AD to 220 AD.
So people just stopped developing technologies, stopped learning, stopped caring.
I think it's partially, I think it's a situation where you have laziness. When you're so prosperous, you become weak. It's like that little thing, weak men, stuff like that. You've heard that.
Good times create weak men create bad times.
Yeah,
bad times create strong men.
and I look at our society. We are, picture of hedonistic Romans is them laying around on their couches, eating grapes and beating their slaves and having massive orgies. Right? That's what these movies show us. Nowadays you look around. We go to these football games. Half of our population's obese. None of us want to sweat outside. I mean, how is that not like comparable to Roman hedonism and laziness? So. All
right, Adam, do you have anything to add on the role of technology?
Well, I mean, I'm listening to what David said, and I guess if you categorize ideas and sort of attitudes and ethos as a form of technology, which I guess you could do that, then what he's saying makes sense. But to me, technology is things that are built to hand, useful things, tools, and while the Roman Empire is of course famous for a lot of innovations in things like architecture and aqueducts and running water, sanitation, those kind of things, I don't really see a parallel between that and the hyper-sonic boom of technology that we've seen explode at the beginning of the 20th century, starting probably with the discovery and the use of electricity and moving on through digital communications, satellites, nanotechnology, computer technologies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think that there's anything comparable to the vast, almost mind-boggling technological advancements that have occurred in the last 120 years or so in our world to what I see when I read the history of the Roman Empire. So, but I'm confining technology to things to hand, to things that are built, to engineering, to things that are useful, tools. Okay. Now, if you look at technology in the broader sense of ideas. Well, yeah, what David's saying makes a lot of sense.
And I don't dispute what he's saying. As far as, and I mentioned that before, like AI, I don't think we've stopped innovating. And,
right. It seems we're leading in innovation still, and it seems like, anytime.
It depends, because, and that's where I brought up the social media. I've not seen any impact of AI, on a tangible level. So, I mean, could it? Yeah. I mean, it could present, some innovation, but if it doesn't deliver, where does that leave us? I mean, it leaves us, closer and closer to this decay.
But you got to also ask, we've had so many decades where we were the leaders of the world. We had all this wealth here, right? And, it's no secret that the government has developed technologies that we don't know, right? We don't find out until decades later. So it feels to me, at least, like on the technology bit, we got a little bit in the bank here. We got a few good years left in us yet.
Well, with that increase in technology, I mean, the Roman Empire, not only on the idea side, but on the physical, actual, atomic, innovation side, all those innovations dried up. The next major innovation was the windmill, and that was 800 AD, 900 AD, or the damming technology in the Netherlands. So, and the printing press was 1,000 years later. So, I mean, we're still churning out innovations, but I think Peter Thiel pointed it out to Rogan. The atomic innovations as far as our day-to-day lives in the last 50 years have kind of plateaued. We're still driving the same cars. We're still using the same stuff. Are still watching TVs. I mean, at the end of the day, we're not seeing, most of our innovation is in here.
Right, but he feels right, and he says that that's really what technology means these days. It just means computing. But he also points out that we've purposely put the brakes on nuclear power because of that India thing that he claims. I mean, obviously,
Adam's got a different take on it.
Yeah, so. It's an interesting take too. But assuming that had something to do with it, and that the government was really just trying to safeguard American interests, that would certainly explain why we haven't taken advantage of it. That doesn't mean we couldn't tomorrow, and we are sitting on a bunch of resources, right? The main thing that should appeal to people about Trump's platform is that he wants to drill, and maybe that would be the only physical, practical thing that could keep us from collapsing. So I can see that. But anyway, all right. So I think we already kind of covered education. Was there anything specific that you wanted to add as far as education goes on top of technology?
I mean, no, I mean, I hit
Okay.
on that.
So let's talk about military, because I know that was a big thing. The Roman military declined. A lot of people have the feeling that our military here is declining. So I'm sure you guys are going to be able to draw some parallels here. So let me start with you, David, again. What would you say? How would you say the decline in the military contributed to the collapse of the Roman Empire?
Well, I mean, you had a situation where the military no longer stopped being beholden to the state, and they became beholden to individual emperors who rewarded them with money and benefits and things like that. I don't think we've gotten to that point yet, but I could see if that becomes a next step in this, then at that point the military just becomes another corporation doing the work of an individual. And if that were to happen, I think that would be indicative of the last stages of this.
But you don't think that our military is in trouble?
No, because I mean, I think it is decaying as far as spending and things like that. Not getting the bang for the dollar. I mean, there's all these reports, and I don't know how much of it's propaganda or if it's real or not. But from the perspective of our military, I think the other parallel from that, when you become a ragtag force of mercenaries, is you're not worried necessarily about discipline. You're not worried about necessarily doing the hard work the military person has to do. So by 250 AD, it used to be the 20 years of service that you did. You were out there on the front lines. You were well drilled. You were marching 10 miles, 20 miles a day. You were carrying everything. And now all of a sudden you have your family in the tent with you. You're riding a cart to the battlefield. You see the two differences. Mm-hmm. You have essentially a whole camp of people show up with you. To are you going to be disciplined? You're no longer a force, and I don't think that kind of goes over to us. But that's just an example of how the Roman military broke down. It stopped being a well-drilled, oiled machine, where if you looked at it, from above, you would see formations, you would see things that were able to defeat a force that's 5 times bigger than it by organizing and being disciplined.
Which emperor or which leader would you say kind of oversaw that transition from an organized, effective military to an inept, undisciplined military?
I think after Marcus Aurelius went out, his son Commodus was inept. The next guy that came along that restored order was a guy named Septimius Severus, and he was a pure military man, and he believed and taught his sons, which one of them was Caracalla, that they should only be beholden to the military, and they should give everything to the military. So he raised the taxes, to unsustainable amount to pay the military, to basically bribe them, and that's good. Everything's okay for a while, right? I mean, if you're taxing the population and taking all their money to essentially subsidize your wars and everything else, at a certain point, the population's going to revolt, though. So that went on for a little while, but that laid the groundwork for the civil wars, because now the military feels like they can be enriched by an individual. So,
Adam?
Well, to me, the way I see it is that for a nation or a civilization to raise a military, and for that military to be an effective fighting force, that nation has to offer a slate of ideas, a slate of values, an ethos to the individual soldiers, which they are willing to fight and die for, which they are willing to give up their life to preserve. And I think when you look at the Roman military and its fragmentation, the fragmentation of its values as the society collapsed, I think they lost that ethos, and they ended up having to, essentially bring in mercenaries, which are people who don't have an ethos other than money. And they're, as long as you pay me, I'll fight for you, and as soon as you stop, I won't. I think that there's at least the beginnings of that happening from what I see in our society, and I think it's reflected in our military. I'm not sure that the American Empire circa 2024 has any consistent ethos or any consistent set of values which they can provide to the mass of the soldiery, which would inspire them to fight and die for that set of values. Because at the end of the day, you're putting your life on the line, and if you die, you can't spend the money. But the values are forever, at least in the mind of the soldier as he's marching into war to perhaps sacrifice his life for the nation that he's fighting for. And so I do see, I think, a parallel there in that. And I don't know how you remedy that once you've lost it. And it appears to me, I don't know what the 2024 incarnation of America, what set of values they're selling or providing to their soldiers, which they think these people are going to march into war and fight and die for, because I just don't see a coherent set that even exists at this point.
In America?
Yeah.
Well, I think a lot of patriots still believe in the Constitution, still believe in liberty and the fundamentals.
Does the government still believe in that?
Well, it doesn't sound like that really matters, right? Like as far as like
Boris, you have to kind of read the room. I mean, the media, the governance apparatus is selling us a message that America is bad.
This is stolen land.
But who's buying it?
I don't think the majority of people.
A great many people are. Not all of them. A great many of people are.
Yeah, a great many of non-Americans may be buying it because they want to stick it to the most powerful nation on.
Yeah, but it doesn't.
Let me point out. I said I saw the beginnings of that. I'm not disagreeing that there are still people who hold classic traditional civilizational values of America. What I'm saying is those values are dying, and the current government and the current administration, it does not support them, and in fact views them apparently in many cases as a net negative, and argues against them. And I think that as you do that, you weaken your military, because you weaken the ethos which motivates the soldier to be willing to march into war and die for his country.
Can I draw a parallel to the Russian government after Perestroika? They've spent the last 30 years, 40 years, however long it is, basically propagandizing that, America is responsible for all of its woes. Last 10 years, Ukraine is, run by, despotic, pedophiles and crazy cocaine addicts and things like that. And so over time, the people that were there before, the only people that are living are the people that are brought up in that environment. So extrapolate out what Adam is saying for the next 40 years, and if the government continues doing what it's doing as far as destroying our ethos, destroying what it means to be an American, saying that we're shit, we're crap. And that's all of what anybody knows. We grew up in a time that was different. We saw something different. But can you imagine your kids and their kids seeing nothing other than that?
Well, I noticed even with the DNC, they're very patriotic. I mean, the last 4 nights, they're all about America. They use very similar rhetoric to the RNC, or to the people of the RNC. So clearly, the sense of patriotism isn't gone from the American public, I don't think.
For those sound bites, because it sounds good, right?
Well, the fact that it still sounds good indicates to me that the majority of Americans still want to hear it, that we're still very much in that mindset. And so
I think that there's a very large and very vocal and very powerful thought structure that is operating within not only the government, but its ancillaries like the media and et cetera, who have taken the position that, European culture, which was essentially built by white men, is a priori a negative. And I think as you push that, and as that idea take holds in the youth, and as that idea is implanted in the youth through various mechanisms like television, social media, education, etc., even in the academic world it's being pushed. I think as that is pushed, it erodes that civilizational set of values, which I think is critical to a strong military, because I don't see how you get a soldier to fight and die for anything other than a set of values that he believes are more valuable than his own personal life itself.
Going back to Rome. So if the Catholic Church is saying this place is shameful, it's horrible, it's decrepit, it's evil, and why is anyone going to go out and fight for it? Why is anyone going to try and save Rome?
Well, but that's the thing, though. I mean, things are either are or they aren't, right? Like, people aren't stupid.
Just saying,
if you believe that your civilization is illegitimate and America was founded in 1619 because slaves came over then, and that everything that resulted from the activities of the government post-slavery is built upon slavery and therefore a priori bad or negative, at some point, as that set of mindset takes hold, it has to erode the military power of the country, because it erodes what holds the military together and what motivates the military to fight.
Well, I understand that. That does seem very theoretical, though, right? Like, of course, right? People need to have something to fight for, but the notion that people are just gonna believe the first thing they're told.
Maybe it is theoretical, but at the same time, look at the performance of our military in recent military conflicts. It's not exactly been stellar.
Well, the military conflicts themselves have been problematic, though.
I'm not saying it's the only reason, but I think it's a contributing factor.
Well, do you think our military underperforms?
Well, I think they did in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan.
Underperformed. I mean, we were piecemealing troops into Vietnam.
We basically lost or stalemated all those wars.
Well, but that was, remember,
But that's not the fault of the military that was fighting them. No, okay.
Well, we were piecemealing the troops because there was no support for the war at home, right? Like, people were very much against the Vietnam War, certainly after the initial stages of it. And so when you didn't have support for the war at home, that's really what created problems, and it created shortages, because how can you prosecute a military campaign if you don't have support?
Well, the real lack of support for the Vietnam War really started in 67, 68 after it became clear to everybody that we were going to lose. Okay, I don't think that was always the case.
I have heard it said that had we sent the troops that we had we fully committed our military like you would expect to win a war, we would have won. But we didn't do that. We piecemealed it.
Right, I agree. We would have won all those wars, but we didn't because our war fighting ethos has been undermined, is what I'm trying to say.
Well, I don't think that had to do with the quality of our military. It had to do with the quality of the engagements and decisions from civilian politicians. Right? Because
you can think that if you want, but the military is the one that had to fight. The military is the one that lost the fight. That's all there is to it. They lost in Vietnam. We lost in Iraq. We lost in Afghanistan. Those are facts. Those are empirical facts. I don't think you can judge the performance of the military by anything other than the results that they get. And since World War II, we haven't won a war. Period.
Well, first Gulf War, if you count that, maybe.
Well, I mean, the first Gulf War is inseparable from the second Gulf War, in my opinion.
Can I add something?
And Gaddafi's dead. We got that guy.
And that's worked out so well.
Can I ask or draw something else?
It's not really fun.
So you know the loss of the ethos that Adam's referring to, the loss of that naturally lends to the soldiers who are there becoming now loyal to a personality, to an individual. And so the natural transition that happens is that they become beholden to a dictator type. They become beholden to their generals. And so, I always say this, sometimes to people that, complain about Trump. I say if it wasn't Trump, it would be another person. And the reason why is because he is a caricature of the time. The decay creates people like Trump. And so the loyalty that you have, the next step of this would be, because if they don't have an ethos, they have to be loyal to somebody, right? They're going to become loyal to a general that they like or to a leader that they like. That's how you transition to that next step that I was talking about in the Roman Empire. They stop respecting the Constitution. They stop respecting the standards that are there, the Senate. They start essentially respecting just the general, the guy that provides for them, that ensures that they have somebody to fight for and die for. That's where it goes next.
The thing is, though, Trump. What's wrong with Trump exactly, though? Why is he a caricature of our times?
I'm just saying
he may be the guy we need in our times, and he's very much, whatever you say about Trump, he's quintessentially American, right?
Maybe he'll be the George Washington steering the boat for the Delaware, in the middle of the winter. Maybe he'll be that guy.
Well, I think right now we'd all settle for a guy who's just not steering the plane directly into the mountain.
Yeah, sure.
Well, Charles Manson is quintessentially American too. Yeah.
Well, God bless him.
Same.
But do you understand what I'm saying? I'm saying the lack of Adam's ethos, the lack of the something to believe in. Naturally, you're going to believe in something else. You have to. It's just like the void, the hole that you plug with something to believe in. Religion. You're going to plug the hole, and if you're a military person, who are you going to fight for? You're going to fight for the most charismatic general. That's what you would do. That's what I would do. That's what Adam would do if they were in the military. If you're going to believe in anything, you're going to believe in the guy, leading you to battle. So.
All right. So I do have a specific question, and maybe you don't know these personalities. I would assume you do. Stilicho. He was a regent, right? And he was fighting against Alaric, or is it Alaric?
Alaric, yeah.
Yeah. So, do you know anything about that?
Sticcio, I believe, was what they called a magister militium.
Yes.
Yeah, and so he was actually of maybe Vandal descent, and he actually was the guy, the puppet master that was ruling Rome, and it wasn't actually the emperors that were ruling. That's why when you had
because they were kids, right?
Yeah, when we talked about it before, remember a sign of an empire in decay is like puppets, essentially, of kids.
Well, what was surprising to me is that he apparently was extremely effective. He was a very good general, and he made some really promising attempts to unify the empire, quash revolts, and all that. But he was also sort of making diplomatic overtures to the Goths, right? And then after he was assassinated, the people that came after him essentially broke those ties and caused Rome to be invaded by
he also killed off a lot of people that were actual Romans that had integrity, people that essentially wanted to do good and to actually unify the empire, not for self-enrichment.
So but why but Alaric wanted to become a Roman, right?
I think a lot of them did.
So what's that about?
Boris, we have Guatemalan people climbing over the border that want to become Americans.
The prestige of the Roman Empire survived the beginning of the decay, probably.
But then why did they fight these guys? If these guys wanted to be Roman, right? Like why fight Alaric to the bitter end and create new enemies when you could bring him in and have new allies?
Well, they did that. They did that with Attila the Hun. They basically converted
the Huns were the reason that the Goths were there.
No,
in the
but
first place, right?
They did that to a number of them. They were able to convert them, and the fall of the Roman Empire. Basically, the guy who removed him was a barbarian that didn't get paid. His dad refused to pay him. Romulus Augustus's dad, he was a kid, refused to pay the barbarian troops, and so they decided just to replace him. But they didn't kill him. They let him go live out his days in a villa. But that shows you how little power that boy had. Because they were like, dude, you can go live on a villa, bro. We don't care.
All right. So economics. I read, and I thought, this was interesting. I read it on Wikipedia. So that's pretty much the extent of my learning on the subject, that there was a significant wealth gap between the gold-owning rich people and the cash-holding poor. And that had to do had something to do with the dismantling of social cohesion. So true story or no?
So I've actually read the economics of it because I love economics, and the part about the taxation was really interesting to me. Italy was exempt from taxation, by the way. Everybody that lived in Italy, the Roman citizens, none of them had to pay. There was a small inheritance tax on property, but that was about it. And roughly when things started going sideways is when they decided to basically start taxing Italy. So Italy got a free ride for like 200-300 years of the empire, but there was always interesting things like debasement of currency. There was inflation. There was property ownership. Who could own what. So all these aspects were you think our property laws and property code from the British common law is complex. Theirs was just as complex. You had lawyers that worked on inheritances. So you had a system that was built up to deal with this stuff. This is why it also provided the passing of wealth and things like that. It provided stability for people. But the economics, I think, really come down to one thing, and that's slavery.
Really?
And when the Christianity told the slaves as well as the rich guy that their souls were identical, they were the same. That's when it slowly became a question of why are they enslaved, and by the time that the Vikings came over, they encountered a slaveless society. And so the Vikings ended up basically pillaging them and taking them as slaves, the Christians they encountered in England. So,
well, we ceased to be a slave owning society some time ago, and
free labor is better than paid labor, right, Boris?
Well, no, obviously,
if you can get it.
Obviously not, because apparently if you depend on the evil of slavery, then eventually it always comes back to bite you in the ass, because then you become dependent on it, and then it leads to your collapse when you can no longer sustain it.
We have some information like Justinian's cistern baths, the underground things that held the water in Constantinople or Istanbul. They were built with 5,800 slaves working around the clock for like 2-3 years. So now imagine how long and how many hands and how many people worked on the Colosseum.
Yeah.
And imagine, if you can do that for free.
But I
versus
understand
paying
that,
for it.
man. But it really sounds like what you guys are both describing is a bubble, right? Like it's a bubble, and the slavery contributed to the bubble.
I'm not convinced on the economics of that argument, because you still have to feed the slaves and give them clothes and give them a place to sleep, and the wages that you pay to subsistence laborers is essentially just enough money for them to get clothes, get food, and have a place to sleep. So I'm not sure that there's such a huge variance between the economic output required to sustain that kind of building effort between a slave population and a paid peasant worker population.
I mean, you can make that argument, but look at Saudi Arabia and Dubai. I mean, they're built on the backs of slaves right now, and look how much cool shit they've built.
Yeah, but they have massive oil wealth that they're basically using to subsidize everything
for as long as they can. And Dubai is sinking, man. They thought they could control nature. They seeded clouds.
But I'm telling you, like they built some really cool stuff. Like it's well documented. Thousands of slaves have died building this stuff.
The biggest buildings in the world are in China, and those aren't built with slave labor.
Yeah, but if you look at Dubai and Saudi Arabia and the entire Arabian Peninsula before the oil wealth was discovered there, you'll see that they did have slaves, but they had nowhere near the standard of living that they had now for 1,000 years.
Oh yeah, and I don't dispute that. So, I'm just saying.
But you felt like the gap between the rich and the poor, like the one that Bernie Sanders was on about, and the one that's obvious, like the 1%,
the 1% and the 99%.
Yeah, the 1%.
I think that's only a problem when you have no more pathway to progress from that low rank to a decent living.
And did that happen in Rome?
And I think, like I gave you the example of the Greek slave who was a freedman who became wealthy. At certain points, some of the freedmen became advisors to the emperor. They became tutors. Like I think Nero's tutor was.
But there was no path forward for them necessarily. The ones that were freed by like a twist of luck, right?
No, sometimes just like you would have in, I guess, the South, where a guy died, he freed his slaves.
Right, but again, that's providence. That's not like a path forward where you can take advantage of certain steps.
Well, there's more. Hadrian passed a Bill of Rights on how to treat your slaves, so you can no longer be cruel to them. Okay. This is 138 AD. So you can just wantonly kill them, So there was now civil rights for slaves.
Gotcha.
So, kind of where we're going with illegals. There's civil rights for them now, They are enslaved.
We're not using... Wait, what?
A lot of the illegals are enslaved.
I think the masses have to believe that there is upward mobility. Whether there is actual upward mobility in any but the rarest cases, I think, is a separate question. I think as long as you can maintain the faith in the 99% that they can somehow move up, I think that's probably enough, because the reality is the vast majority of the 99% will never move up.
Well, I have a real life...
In America?
Anywhere.
No, I disagree with that.
Yeah,
so I have a real life...
Two cases in point.
Well, I have a real life example. I grew up in England until I was about 13. My observation of the scenario there is that no matter how hard you work, lawyers get paid $20,000 a year, teachers get paid $15,000 a year. The cost of living is like it is in New York City. There is absolutely no chance ever that you will progress anywhere.
Well, you also go to jail for 2 years for posting something on Twitter.
Yeah, but
so it's complete.
You may not own a car. You may not own a house. In fact, all the property is owned by the crown. So in that society, there is absolutely no chance for you to ever go live in a mansion unless you inherit wealth.
Right, but that's the society whose ass we kicked. So that this would not happen here.
So here I see people that essentially,
yes,
we kicked England's ass.
Yes, in the Revolutionary War.
Okay.
But here I actually see people.
Remember that? Remember they used to wear the red coats that were really.
They've been on our side for like 150 years.
Remember they shot at Washington like 7 times, killed like 3 horses.
You're going all the way back. I thought we were in the 20th century.
I've met people here that have arrived with nothing, myself included, but even people that have been way more successful than me. With a suitcase. And these
my
people,
dad was a welder. My mom's a teacher. I'm a lawyer. Like that sounds to me like in a decade, right? That's the American dream. You come here with nothing and you get something.
It doesn't mean that it's everybody, but if you put there is an opportunity. If you put work in it, you're diligent, you're self-disciplined, you can go somewhere, and you don't have to be the smartest guy.
Out of all the families, David, that immigrated here with us, all of them are in the same boat. All of them raise children that now have families that are successful, that are working really, really hard. I can't name a single person. I mean, I'm sure there are people like that, but you think about it. Everybody, well, you kind of came separately, right? Because you guys had that whole legal adventure, but we came with other Armenian families that were also refugees.
Upward mobility from the proletariat to the bourgeoisie or to the middle class to the petty bourgeoisie is very much still real in America. But upward mobility from the proletariat or from the lower bourgeoisie to the elite is almost non-existent.
Who the hell wants to be elite anyway?
I do.
Yeah.
I would somewhat agree with that, but I mean, at the end of the day, you do have. I mean,
we live like kings already.
But to get to the 1%
we
anyway,
have homes and running water and amazing children, and we don't deny ourselves anything in food.
Look, I'm not complaining. I'm just saying, if you're talking about the 1% and the 99%, to move from the 99% to the actual 1% to the elite to the millionaire billionaire class, it's extremely rare.
That's fair.
It's extremely rare.
Well, they're extremely rare to begin with.
It's just like the hope of, it's like winning the lottery. Like everybody hopes to win the lottery. As long as you have that hope, you'll still play the lottery, right? As long as you have that hope that somehow you might move up into the 1%, you'll play the game and work hard and try to move up.
But everybody
what I'm saying is there's a psychological aspect to this that is, I think, probably the most important aspect of it.
Okay, but consider this though, the 1%, right, in America. Mm-hmm. Maybe we don't, but the most prolific ones, right? Like Bill Gates, right? You may hate him, you may disagree, and I find some of the things he says and does questionable, but he was brilliant. He was a brilliant software guy, and he was able to build something. Elon Musk, he was able to build something. Jeff Bezos started out as a bookseller and built something. Mm-hmm. So, that nothing about that seems like a mystery to me, and they are definitely elite, and they came up from middle class to
that's 3 people out of 160 million.
Well,
are we talking about 1% by wealth, net worth, or are we talking about 1% income? What are we talking about?
I wasn't really distinguishing.
I don't really think that
because
really matters.
The 1% for income is like something like $383,000 per year, and 1% for property holdings is something like $1 million. So if you look at it, I mean, already a ton of people that fit that criteria. Yeah. So if you're talking about 0.1%, 0.01%, then yeah. But
I mean, to me, it seems like
about the elite in the sense of rising to the height of power. Rising to the height of political power through your own efforts and through your own work.
Well, but the 3 people I named did do that, right?
Well, sure. Out of 160 million, that's a very small percentage, which is what I've said it was.
But it's also the only examples we can think of. Like, you can't think of other people. Like everybody even Barack Obama, right? Let's say he went from nobody, but then he was a senator. Then he was, he worked hard. A lot of these people went to like Ivy League schools because they were like, Kamala Harris, they want to paint her as an idiot. She's not an idiot, right? She's a senator. She's very, very smart. No, she is though. It's a joke to call her an idiot, right? Like it's kind of silly.
I disagree. Disagree 100%.
Question for you: were some of the emperors idiots?
Well, I would call people idiots for less than that. I'm not saying that I'm not without sin here. That I'm without sin here. All right, let's move on. So the next thing I wanted to ask about is religion as it relates to the collapse. We already kind of covered that. But specifically what I want to know about is your view on the tension between paganism and Christianity. That seems to have been the initial kind of conflict, right?
Yeah.
And then Islam, right? Kind of on top of that. And just kind of how you analyze all of that in connection with the collapse.
I mean, Islam didn't become a thing until like 600 AD after the collapse.
Yeah.
Well, after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire,
it became more of a problem for Byzantine.
It was a huge problem for the Eastern Roman Empire,
right.
but Islam did not exist. By the time Islam existed, there was no Western Empire. Am I wrong about that?
That's correct.
Islam was like 630 AD.
Well, in fact, the Islam Empire took over half of Spain and Sicily and invaded Sardinia.
So here's the thing, right? It's easy, I think, for Christians, and we're all cultural Christians, right? In the sense that we were brought up in that mentality. It's easy for us to see how Christianity might prevail over paganism, right? It has unifying qualities, universalist qualities. It's sort of an equalizer. Why was Islam so successful? So much more successful, arguably. You can view Islam as as to Christianity as Christianity was to paganism, no?
No, I don't think so.
Well, that's what I was curious about.
Islam started from a unified military movement. I mean, Muhammad was a great general and a military leader who also adopted this whole like spiritual aspect to his political regime.
So you're asking why maybe Christianity? It would come down to the fact that it was decentralized, feudalistic. The infrastructure wasn't there. Whereas, like Adam says, it's a unified military movement, and you have a larger concentration in a federal-like entity, empire, dealing with small little sprinklings of states.
If Jesus had been like a Roman emperor or a Roman consul or some kind of super powerful, Roman general who also happened to found Christianity, then I would say, yeah, there's a connection there. But
well, no, it's just I guess my question had more to do with why did folks find Christianity to be more compelling than paganism? Okay. Because there was a mass conversion.
I
right?
think there was a long period of the sort of the falling away of the spiritual power of paganism in the Hellenistic culture that is already present when you read Plato. I mean, you can see Plato and the people that he's talking to, sort of tongue-in-cheek, almost mocking the anthropomorphic aspects of pagan religion. I mean, these gods went from being allegories and symbols of certain spiritual ideas to old men in the sky who were ridiculous and obviously didn't exist. And that sort of change of mind, that change of perspective, that change of really civilization, I think was clear, is clear from reading Aristotle and Plato, and I think that continued all the way through the Roman period when it was finally replaced by Christianity.
So you have essentially, we have the benefit of looking back on it all, but imagine living in an environment where everything is falling apart, where barbarians are coming in that are destroying you, going to eat you, kill you, everything is burning, and the gods that you've had that you've been praying to are not around. They're not doing anything about it.
Well, yeah, but Christianity was invading Rome before there was such.
No, I know, but here comes Christianity and says you're shameful. You because of your beliefs, this is what has happened. And so now, if you believe in Jesus, Jesus will save you for eternity, or you can perish in this fire and be succumbed to the Goths.
So that's suffer. A slightly different version, but I accept it. I think that, and I accept your version too. But what's interesting is I've heard Islam described to me or the difference between Christianity and Islam described to me in very similar terms to the way you just described the difference between paganism and Christianity. Okay. I.e., in paganism there being that allegory and all that, but then once they get elevated to being deities, the allegorical aspects is what ends up dragging them down because they end up looking so ridiculous. I think
it's because they've got. I think what I was trying to say is the decline was at least partially the result of these people, the believers, losing contact with the allegory, with the spiritual metaphors that these gods were representing, and starting to view them as actual old men in the sky, and Correct. Thus as utterly irrational and ridiculous.
So yes, exactly. And don't you think, like, you often not criticize me, but you often point out that I tend to render the God of the Christians as a caricature. Right. I think very much in the same way. And sure. And Christianity lends itself to that because the God of the Old Testament, the demiurge, and some formulations, right, was so anthropomorphic. He had these feelings like wrath and bitterness and resentment and frustration and regret.
I mean, the view of Yahweh, or the view of God the Father in Christianity as an old man with a beard in the sky is still very much prevalent today.
Yes, so
which is what folks like yourself often criticize.
We do, and relentlessly. It's interesting that you zoned in on that.
And I always say that you're focused on the allegory. You're focused on the surface and not on the substance, because the substance is what the ideas that are represented by these allegories.
But the allegories are what leads to, or the allegory itself, the wordplay, the anthropomorphizing of God in the Old Testament is what leads to the ultimate caricature, the incompatibility of those features with a godlike entity who's supposed to be omniscient, omnipotent, and all of those things, and undefined.
The parables are for the masses and for the ones who don't have the
Can I ask you a question?
Ability to, or who don't have the inclination to go further, and that's what they're used for. but they're still parables at the end of the day. Jesus taught in parables for a reason. It says in the Bible that the truth of the kingdom of heaven will be revealed to you in secret.
But here's the interesting thing, right? The Quran doesn't have that problem.
Well, I was going to say
yes, and that is apparently the big distinction. Not for some, but the person I spoke to, was
and the whole Old Testament is part of.
Yeah, but we don't have an image of Allah, right? I've never seen an image of Allah.
They don't allow
They don't exactly for them, and this was something that Khalid explained to me.
The image of Yahweh in traditional Judaism either.
He's a Sunni Muslim from Saudi Arabia. Very intelligent. We had that conversation, and that's what he pointed to. And I thought that was really interesting because he's like, but you have to understand, like in Islam, we don't think of God the way you Christians do. We don't think of him as something that you can even think about like that. He does not have attributes.
Right. It's an Eastern ethos. It's very similar to
and
Buddhism.
maybe that explains the proliferation of Islam, even relative to Christianity, because it is the world's largest growing religion now. Like I
don't know if it's larger than Christianity. Maybe.
I don't know if it's gotten to that point, but it's certainly growing more rapidly than Christianity, from what I've seen.
Well, atheism is growing faster than all of it, probably.
Woohoo! All right.
I would say Buddhism is that kind of
reason.
Or wokeism.
Oh, you go away.
For what I can understand of Buddhism is very similar to that as well. It does not lead itself to anthropomorphism, except for in certain flavors of it that have sprung up in certain local areas, but the general idea, this nirvana and samsara, these are huge, wide, broad, almost metaphysical propositions that don't, in my view, lend themselves to anthropomorphism in any way.
All right, I got a few other topics that I want to cover, so I'll try to make it quick. We're at about the 1:30-minute mark. Environment and disease. There were several pandemics that wiped out large swaths of population.
Sure.
What would you say? How would you say that contributed to the collapse, if it did?
I think it means a lot more back then than it means now. Lack of health care. Now we have a little bit more, but more so the Mayan civilization as opposed to the Roman civilization. The environmental degradation played a big part in it. So that could be a factor, but I don't think that Rome was necessarily poorly influenced by its environment. I don't think they had any of those problems.
Wasn't it a particularly fertile area at one point, and then that declined? And
not in Rome, but in the Yucatan Peninsula, it's my understanding that was the case. So I think one of the things that, if you look at it closely, the Mayans had deforested the whole entire Yucatan Peninsula, and it caused massive environmental degradation. So,
well, if you want to go to the New World in the Americas, the diseases, the bacteria and viruses brought over by the Europeans during the conquest destroyed far more of their civilization than the conquistadors ever did. That's just a historical
So
fact.
where'd you guys rank that, right? We talked about religion, we talked about economics, military, the technology. Would you say that those environmental and disease factors played a greater role in the collapse?
For some, but not all.
I don't know about the Roman Empire. I know that there were horrible plagues at the end. I know there's periods of Roman history that we don't even have much of a historical record of, because apparently the situation, the environmental disease, medical situation was so bad that there's just not a heck of a lot of writing, and there's not a heck of a lot of record keeping for like 60 years in the 400s. Isn't that correct?
Yeah. One of the reasons why Marcus Aurelius had to deal with the invasion is because they say, some of the problems that they were experiencing was because of the preceding emperor had the Antonian plague broke out and killed millions of people.
Yeah.
And in fact, Commodus's sibling, who was probably going to be the guy who would be picked over him, so Commodus was the second pick, would have been the one who would be emperor, died of the plague.
Gotcha.
Another huge thing that contributed to the collapse of the cultures of the Central Americas was that we brought alcohol, and these people had lived 1,000+ years without any real consumption of alcohol, and they didn't have any genetic ability to resist this, the addiction and the negative consequences of consuming this drink, and that has decimated native cultures all over North America and I presume South America.
But keep in mind, they were doing okay with just cocaine, coca leaves.
They didn't have cocaine. They had coca leaves, which is a totally different level of addiction.
They didn't
totally
have
different
gasoline to process them in yet.
Coca leaves are about as much of a stimulant as coffee. Okay, it's not the same as cocaine.
They had what was the stuff the Indians do? The
kratom.
Not kratom. The
Jimson weed.
no, the
mescaline.
Mescaline. They had that.
Yeah, peyote.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we gave them those things, and then they
So
gave alcohol.
when you have two great gigantic cultures that live in isolation because of oceans for 1,000, maybe 5,000 years, and all of a sudden you bring them together, you have these unforeseen consequences that result from these biological factors like disease and like bacteria and like technologies that maybe one group is not ready to or does not understand the consequences of.
But it does seem like population collapse is integral.
I think that's just the end stage. That's the last.
That
stage.
is the last stage.
Yeah.
So you saw the Peter Thiel interview, right? So he proposes that Rome became depopulated. So it went from a population, a significant population, to just a few thousand people, and he views that as kind of a marker of its collapse. But you have a different take on it. Is that correct?
Well, that is like an indication of something not going right. I gave you Britain as well as an example, but unlike Britain, when you have a centralized, like energy builds up, I gave you that example. So think of Rome as a huge buildup of energy, and if you're no longer able to sustain that reaction, if it's no longer getting fuel, its aqueducts are no longer working because the barbarians sacked them and destroyed them, which they did. The population is going to disperse to the countryside to get food, right? So, the population of Europe quickly became more rural. And in the medieval times, most of the population lived out in the countryside. Just like we find in, poorer countries in the world. When you don't have urbanization, that's where they go. And then when times are good, people urbanize. That's what's happened throughout history. You go all the way back to the Egyptian Empire, too. So I think it's just a symptom. Depopulation of cities is a symptom of, something being wrong in the cities.
So the Wikipedia article on the decline and collapse of the Roman Empire has a section titled "Social Crisis," and it's interesting because it says that the new supreme rulers disposed of the legal fiction of the early empire, seeing the emperor as but the first among equals. Emperors from Aurelian onwards openly styled themselves as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, titles appropriate for a master-slave relationship. Then it goes on to say that official cruelty, supporting extortion and corruption may also have become more commonplace. One example being Constantine's law that slaves who betrayed their mistress's confidential remarks should have molten lead poured down their throats. It goes on to essentially suggest that, how like in The Prince, Machiavelli talks about, being loved or feared. And he says that, you're better off being feared, but never be hated. Remember? And it sounds like they kind of lost sense of that and decided that it. So
I think a lot of that was already going on. I mean, Caligula wanted to be treated as a god in 40 AD, and every emperor that died was considered a deity. So they were deified, and they had the cult of Julius Caesar was very prominent and very famous for a long time. So I don't know if any of that is necessarily useful or accurate.
Well,
and that probably traces its roots back through the Hellenized Egyptian and even back through the Egyptian civilization, which merged with Hellenistic civilization after Alexander the Great.
The richest senatorial families, immune from most taxation, engrossed more and more of the available wealth and income, while also becoming divorced from any tradition of military excellence.
So here's an interesting parallel. I remember reading this a while ago. In Rome, by 160 AD, nobody knew what weapons were. They didn't wage wars for like good 20, 30, 40 years. Generations grew up without any kind of conflict. There also were people that banded together to form, peace cults, pacifism. There was graffiti for pacifism, almost to the level of what we had in the 60s. And so you look at this and it's just amazing to read this. Like you had, social groups advocating for political things. And that's what, I guess, wealth and, the convenience of wealth gives you. You have a stable society where people can explore all these ideas. And then when things go sideways, people are worried about eating again. So.
Which is interesting.
They don't have time to worry about peace.
This brings me to something I shared with Adam earlier, the behavioral sink. It's a term invented by ethologist John B. Calhoun to describe a collapse in behavior. That the Wikipedia article says that can result from overpopulation, but the experiment suggests that it has to do with having your needs met. So the experiment was that he took rats, he put them in an environment that was safe, where they had access to food and water that was basically unlimited, and it was big enough to support a population growth. And even though it was able, in the second experiment that he did, even though it was able to support a population of 4,000, around 2,200, a collapse began to occur where there was a complete social disintegration of the rats. They refused to breed, they refused to care for their youngs. The males would groom themselves incessantly. They had their interactions became completely irregulated. They would all cram themselves into the quarters where the food was and would only eat together in a given room, rather than spreading out over the 3 other available rooms. Are you familiar with this?
No, that's interesting.
I think I might have mentioned this to you before, but
So what was the end result?
well, the end result was a complete population collapse. So these rats, even though they had everything given to them, and their place of residence could accommodate even bigger population growth, at some point they just went nuts. They went crazy. And I don't know what this means. I don't think we're rats. I don't know that we can view this as a parallel, but it does sound like, based on the last few things that you said about the collapse of the Roman Empire, that people become complacent. They become...
Well, it's not complacent. When you have too much time to think and worry, you're going to imagine or worry about problems that aren't there. And so I look at the things that we're worried about, the wokeism, the environment, the climate change. We're just looking for something to worry about and have fear over, because we've forgotten to have fear over the basics. And we're inventing things that aren't there, and that is kind of what with the peace cults of the Roman Empire, where they were fixated on having peace and stuff like that. They were inventing social groups. These rats too. So maybe it's because that's part of the symptom of the luxury that you have. You have all this time to think about things.
Biological entities are evolved to struggle for survival, and when you take away the need to struggle for survival, what's left is a biological entity with absolutely nothing to do, with no ethos, with no focus for all of this energy, and that becomes self-destructive once that happens. I think that's the lesson of the experiment.
Well, my initial thought was, because obviously I find the parallel to humanity kind of repugnant, right? But I want to consider it, and I want to give it due weight.
It's the same reason that people go nuts and die when they retire.
But there's art. Right, like man makes art when he doesn't have to.
It doesn't happen to everybody, but what I'm saying is that we are built to have to struggle to survive, and when you take away the necessity of that struggle, when you take that struggle away from us, for a lot of individuals, there's nothing left.
Can I actually ask you? So that's my biggest worry with AI. Mm-hmm. It's not that our lives will be made easier. It's my worry that we will no longer be required to work. Because my worry that's what the retirement. My worry is that what will be our purpose as man at that point?
But why?
Because our struggle will
why do I pick up my guitar and play it in the evenings?
That's not struggle. That's for entertainment. That's leisure.
No. But it's more than just entertainment. It's creative, right? Like, why does Adam play musical instruments when he's not working? That's work. It's hard work. Have you ever tried to write a song? It's hard work. You're revising it. You're putting yourself through the grinder mentally.
Because when I have leisure time, and I need to find a way to focus my mental energy on something other than the struggle for survival, and so I do. It's a respite from the struggle that I have to face every day.
But
to be a lawyer and to be a father and to be a citizen and everything else.
But you feel like if you didn't have to struggle in the rest of your life, that you would not be engaging in these artistic pursuits?
I don't really know, because I've never had a time in my life when I didn't have to struggle to survive, except for maybe in my childhood, and I don't really think that factors into the equation.
Well, no, you still have to struggle to survive. You still have to go to work. I think that's what you meant, right? Like there's your responsibilities, there's that struggle for survival, and then there's the art that you do.
Well, look at what happens to people who are born rich. Their lives often turn out very, very negatively.
Or you win the lottery, for instance. The people that win the lottery, how many of them end up getting murdered?
Helpless like a rich man's child, as the song says.
But we also have examples of the converse.
Well, there's examples. I'm not saying that it's a rule that every single time it happens, it's like 1 + 1 is 2. I'm saying that there's a tendency amongst people who are born rich to have their lives go haywire and go sideways and have massive negative outcomes. And I think a big part of that is because we are built as human beings to struggle for survival. And when we don't have to struggle for survival, our brain doesn't work the way it's supposed to, because our brain is only attuned for one thing, biologically.
I wonder if they gave those rats some paints to play with. What would have happened? But all right,
I wonder if they've actually done that test on chimpanzees because they're of a higher intellect, and to see what kind of reaction
that would be interesting. I don't know that they have, but I don't know. Our scientists have been slacking, so who knows? I also wanted to bring up. So it's interesting because this article regarding the rat experiment. You know how Wikipedia has like external links, and it linked. It was to the hikikomori. Have you guys heard about this? So the hikikomori are Japanese young men who withdraw from society voluntarily, seeking extreme degrees of social isolation and confinement. It refers both to the phenomenon in general and the recluses themselves, described as loners or modern-day hermits. Have you heard about this?
Was this kind of similar to that guy that was living by himself on the video, the first kind of reality TV?
Well, that was that was different. The guy didn't have any kind of problem with him. He was just participating in that experiment. I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
These are guys, like literally young people who feel that they're hopeless.
Oh.
They live in these single room apartments and they just keep to themselves. They never go out.
So Raskolnikov, is that kind of...
Well, no, Raskolnikov
Or
was
what?
pointedly not that, because he was...
Well, I mean, he's kind of living by himself in his apartment.
But
No.
Driven insane slowly.
There's plenty of other characters in Crime and Punishment.
No, I know. I'm just saying that,
He has social relationships.
yeah, he does. And I mean, he cares for his sister. He cares for his mother.
Well, I'm just saying, go on. What's the...
No, I just think it's really interesting because this could be a sign sort of what we're talking about, the disease of opulence, right? Or,
I mean, isn't that really just a modern version of monasticism, of renouncing the world to pursue some other goal, something other than the material world?
Well, except that we are used to thinking of monasticism as sort of like a voluntary thing that an enlightened person does. This seems to be a symptom of the society. Japanese society is very wealthy, it's very secure, but it hasn't always been that way. The way that so it could stand for a similar kind of proposition to the one you were just suggesting, that something breaks in the mind of a biological animal when all of its needs are met.
Right.
It's weird to me, and obviously I'm not like sold on the issue. I worry about
there's
it.
a cultural aspect of Japanese society that's for us is like hugely different than ours.
Mm-hmm.
We're analyzing it from our viewpoint, but their societies are extremely quiet. You go on a subway, nobody talks. You have a discipline that's ingrained in them at a young age. So their way of looking at things and looking at this pursuit may be completely different on how we look at it. You may look at it as depraved. They may not.
There's an archetype.
Well, no. This is a concern for social scientists in Japan.
It?
Yeah.
It's not like a philosophical pursuit, maybe?
No.
At
least that's not the way it's viewed. Sorry.
There's an archetype in Eastern and Japanese and Chinese society of the sage who withdraws from the world and goes up on the mountain to live in solitude. I mean, for example, the myth of Bodhidharma is an example of that. Lao Tzu is also said to have retired to a mountain and lived 100 years in solitude. So that this may be, a creature that is born of a sort of psychological archetype that is present in those cultures and in the minds of those people.
Well, so this is something, again, that the Japanese Ministry of Health is actually concerned about. The Japanese Ministry of Health defines hikikomori as a condition in which the affected individual refuse to leave their parents' house, do not work or go to school, and isolate themselves from society and family in a single room for a period exceeding 6 months. The psychiatrist Tamaki...
Sounds like neatism in America.
Yeah, it sounds like...
neats are?
No.
Not in education, employment, or training. It's the children who don't do anything but just live in their room and hang out on the internet all day. They're known in popular culture on the internet as neats.
It does, yeah.
It's probably about 20% of our population.
So
here.
it's a state that has become a problem by the late 20s that involves co-opting oneself up in one's own... Or cooping oneself up in one's home and not participating in society. Okay. Well, anyway, All right, that was an interesting discussion.
So how did that, other than you just going on a tangent on how did that relate to anything?
Well, I just the more I think about what happened in Rome, that's what triggered my thoughts about the rat thing. I'd read about the rat thing in a different context a long time ago, but when I was reading about the social crisis in Rome and why did Romans stop having that Roman energy to innovate and to drive their society forward? And it does seem like a disease of opulence. You've heard that said, right? The gout, right? People who get gout, you get uric disease or whatever because you're eating fatty, rich foods that used to be reserved for rich people. So there's a disease associated with success.
So when people ask me straight up, why did Rome collapse? And I don't tell them religion or military economics. I tell them because by the time it collapsed, you could never find a Roman in Rome. That's why it collapsed. That's what it really comes down to, because nobody really cared.
I still think it's the togas.
Well, togas are, by the way, the toga also
sucked, man.
By 200 AD, the toga went out of fashion too.
One of my favorite movies of all time, and I mentioned this to you guys before, and I wish you'd watch it one day. It's called The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire. Yeah, it's got Ammar Sharif in it as the Armenian king. Sophia Loren
is that the one from
daughter,
the 60s?
Yeah, the daughter of Marcus Aurelius. It's got.
I think it starts out with the line that you perish from within before you're taken over from without.
Yeah, and there's the Greek philosopher who's a character in the movie who gets killed at the end. Remember, but he gives this speech. He goes, "When does a republic collapse?" And he says, "It's when it stops believing in itself." That's the kind of the conclusion.
But by the way, the toga was actually an interesting thing. You bring that up. The toga was worn during the Republic for ceremonial activities. I think it also carried a kind of economic kind of feel, because once you had enough money to get a toga and wear a toga, you made it. And so by the 200 AD, the toga was looked at as archaic. It was no longer in fashion, just like, the polytheistic religions and things like that were fading away too. So it is another symbol of, the cultural decline. You joke about it, but I think, the toga is actually another example.
Well, what do you know? So Adam was right all along. I think he mentioned the toga at the outset of this conversation, and we just came full circle. All right. Any final words before Adam gives us a prediction?
No, but the last great real emperor, I think, was Aurelian. So you may want to read up on him.
So section 4 that we didn't get to is I did want to talk to you about the leaders and emperors who were primarily responsible for the decline, in your opinion, those who opposed it and resisted it, and who do you think today in America is either one or the other but we'll save that conversation for another time. This is going to be continued, I'm assuming, right? Because
we can talk.
There's
there's tons
discussions to be had on the subject, and I do want to at some point, and Adam and I have already talked about it. Is maybe he and I will read Gibbon. He'll reread, and I'll read Gibbon, and then we can have a kind of a book club discussion that's more specifically oriented. So, Adam, I open the floor to you.
All right. So for today, the prophecy is: being is one. Heaven and hell are married, and there's nothing new under the sun.
To be continued.
In the way of what you're after, nuisance factor.